I'm Professor Burns of the History Department, and I also wear the hat of the Director of the Center for East Asian Studies. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to the first in a series of lectures sponsored by the Center for East Asian Studies. And I hope that you will join us for the rest of the series. I also wanted to mention to you two upcoming events. One that will take place next Thursday on the 18th. With the title, Why Are the Chinese So Interested in the Jews? And it features our speaker, Professor Xu Xin of Nanjing University. And then a week later, on the 25th, we have our annual Najida Distinguished Lecture, which will be given by Professor Yu Li. And the title is Myself Within Japan, Myself Within Fukushima. So you get a sense of the range of events that are going on related to East Asia on our campus. Now today's speaker is Professor Nak-Chung Paik of Seoul National University, an important literary clinic and a public intellectual, and also, I'm told, the former teacher of our own Professor Chung-Hee Chae. So I think there's a really personal connection to our campus. And today's event has a really interesting format, the talk by Professor Paik, but then a kind of conversation that will feature Professor Bruce Cumings. Professor Paik's title is The Korean Peninsula in Flux, South Korea's Candlelight Revolution and its Impact. And now I'll ask Professor Chae to introduce Professor Paik. In Japanese we call him Unshi, the teacher to whom we are greatly indebted.
Professor Susan was introduced him as my former teacher. I don't think he's still a current teacher. So it is a great delight and privilege for me to introduce to you today Professor Nak-Chung Paik, and also counterparts for the conversation after the talk. Professor Bruce Cumings over there, and probably doesn't need any introduction to you. So this is Professor Paik's third visit to the University of Chicago. The first one took place early 1990s. I think this is the one that two professors actually met for the first time, and that was the University of Chicago. And interestingly, around that time, Professor Bruce Cumings had been already very widely known through his early 80s and also late 80s two-volume works on the origin of the Korean War. So here's a giant in history dealing with Korea, and from Korea, Professor Paik in literature, who was just more than a literary critic. So the connection that I have had with Professor Paik actually dates back to 1980, and that's the time that Korea had a brief momentum of quote-unquote spring of democratization. Shortly after that, Gwangju uprising took place, and the schools were completely shut. And so right before that closing of the university, I met him in a big podium, and he was just coming from the status called dismissed professor. So he was fired for his anti-Yushin activities in the early 70s, 1973. And he did not have an academic job that he held at Seoul National University since age 27 or 8 in 1963. He was just finished his MA, finished his military service, and after he got a BA degree in English and German at Brown University, graduating as valedictorian, and went to Harvard in English. And later in 1972, he'd be writing his dissertation on D.H. Lawrence, and firmly established himself as a very important scholar of D.H. Lawrence, whose works and worldviews and activities have now been still very properly recognized and appreciated. And I think still Professor Paik is very active in the D.H. Lawrence study societies in the world. But his main activities actually was both political and intellectual activities with a much further base from the public mind beyond the pale of Seoul National University. So he, in his late 20s again, just around the time that he became a professor at Seoul National, he founded a very important quarterly journal, intellectual journal titled Creation and Criticism in Korean, 창작과 비평. And that journal would remain as one of the most important shaping journals of many of the generations of intellectuals and others throughout 60s, 70s, and 80s, 90s, and still now. And I think among you, so probably some of the older generation relatively would have already thought about how your life might have been affected through your exposure to and reading of the journal, we say 장비. But even that publisher, 창작과 비평, also went through a similar kind of trajectory as founding editor-in-chief, Professor Paik, because it was shut down and even lost the name, 창작과 비평. So it even had a different name, 창작사. And then only after Korea's democratization, both briefly, first the Professor Paik got back his job and came to classroom in 1980. And in that autumn, I took introduction to British literature, to Romanticism and afterwards from him. And 창작과 비평, the journal itself, also got back its political reputation, and now still one of the most important intellectual journals, and also even financially very sturdy journal, which was not the case when he was founding the journal. And I think that so far it's about literature and intellectual field, but even while he was he served as on the faculty of Seoul National and also chief editor of the journal, he had been very, very active public intellectual all throughout his public career, and he had been very influential in formulating and also spreading the idea of Korea's destiny in the world through his theory of division system. And it came in the 80s as a Korean small pieces of articles, but also as a book, 흔들리는 분단 체제, so system of division, which is shaking or in crisis. And in 2011, this book came out from the University of California Press, forwarded by Professor Bruce Cumings. And this is the first English book publication that began to be known outside of Korea. And it is very, sometimes, it's a kind of poignant for me to think that his books and translations and edited volumes, which many of them are held in Regenstein, and I counted how many, 38 are in Regenstein shelves, just about the ones that authored, edited, translated, and featured him. And also there are other 10-some book publications in Regenstein that includes the whole activities that he has been conducting. And as a final word, as a literary critic, I think I began to really learn about what literature does and what literature is through him. And as many generations of my generation who grew up in the 70s, 60s, or 80s, and he really wanted to ask this question: what is literature? So the task of asking what literature is, and in this book and many others, he really began to really educate the role of literature in a very different ways. Like many great minds in the world of literature, that asking what is literature is not different from what is the world around us and the society and history. And through that ethos, he has been very actively bringing most of the world issues. And so many publications have been already done in English, and yet we are still waiting for the English translation of literary works by him, critical works by him. And here is the Susan Hung, who wrote actually whole dissertation on him. That's very rare in even North American literary and cultural studies. Critics call a single author is now viewed as and she's writing a book, and also his English the translation of literary works are now being translated, and sooner or later we will see that. And I want to just end with the one thing that he produced, he cited in this one, in the preface. I was feeling very kind of nostalgic about those South Korean scenes in the 80s and 90s, even 70s, that what he wants to do in literature had been always kind of intermixed with the pressures. And as soon as he published the first actually major literary work, national literature and world literature, he also published a book, a collection of essays in search of the logic of human emancipation. Again, he began to be sought after by the police, and he was detained. It was around 1979 or so, and that's the time that I began to go to college, and our generation's life has been very much shaped by his activities. And of course, Professor Bruce Cumings is the leader of our the studies on Korea. I think they're allegedly probably the most well-known Koreanist in the world. And interestingly, these two intellectuals never had a public conversation. In other words, in public. I think they probably had a presentation and comments, and yet they never really engaged each other in public, just face to face. So again, this is a very special opportunity for us to really watch this, what I would say, historic conversation. And I'd like to welcome Professor Paik to the podium. Professors and faculty, the Dean Robertson of the Humanities Division, and Professors Bruce Cumings and Norma Field, and especially Connie Ip, who really made a real effort to make this occasion possible, and the grad students for helping me and her. And I hope that these thanks will really go actually to Professor Paik, who was born in 1938. He's very healthy. Came all the way to the University of Chicago. Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Kyung-hee, for the very kind introduction. I'd like to thank the Center for East Asian Studies and the University for inviting me. Especially to my old friend Bruce and Kyung-hee, working to get this invitation. Well, exactly how much time I have. I want to make my talk as brief as possible so that I can have more time for conversation with Bruce, and later with question and answer and discussions with the audience. Is this working now? I'll just make one correction about Kyungie's introduction. This is not the first time that I'm having a public conversation with Bruce. I interviewed him when I first came to Chicago in 1991. And then we had a sort of a panel conversation when he came to Korea after the financial crash, 2008. And both conversations were recorded and published in my journal, Changdi. So, but I'm really delighted and honored that Bruce will join me later for a live public conversation with me. Now, my title is The Korean Peninsula in Flux, South Korea's Candlelight Revolution and its Impact. Now, the first part of that title would be obvious to almost everybody. It doesn't take an expert, which I certainly am not, to recognize that great changes are taking place in the peninsula. Of course, what these changes really mean and where they will lead to are subjects for debate, and I hope we will have some further debate later on. The second part of my title would seem more debatable or questionable, especially to experts, because I'm trying to make the point that candlelight revolution is behind all these great changes taking place in the Korean Peninsula. And it is not even certain that what is called candlelight revolution really adds up to a real revolution. So, and furthermore, in my way of thinking, this notion of candlelight revolution is tied to the notion that Kyungie referred to a while ago, that of the division system of the Korean Peninsula, which is another concept which doesn't enjoy wide consensus. So that may make the concept candlelight revolution, which is related to that of the division system, even more questionable. But to be honest, I like to think that this is the more original part of my contribution to the whole debate, and I hope we may have a chance to examine these notions in more detail later. Kyungie didn't mention, but some of you know that I was privileged to accompany our President Moon Jae-in on his latest visit to Pyongyang, and because many people are curious about what I saw and learned on that trip. I don't really have too much to say. it was only a 2-night visit, and those in the presidential entourage who are not part of the official delegation, they don't get to see much of the crucial things. But I did have the good fortune to observe the North Korean leader relatively close range many times during that short visit. And most people are curious about what kind of guy is Kim Jong-un. And of course, how should I know? It's a brief encounter. But since he's so often depicted both in the American and South Korean media, the sort of madman, I would like to report my honest impression that he was perfectly sane and normal Korean young man. Of course, it doesn't mean that the regime that he leads is a perfectly sane and normal regime. There are many things that I personally do not approve and would not condone. But as far as the man is concerned, I think he's kind of a normal guy. And this is something that you need to take into account as you think about North Korea and its leadership. He has done some reprehensible things, I know, but I don't believe he did it in a fit of madness or rage or anything. He's a man perfectly capable of rational calculation, and I think he does most things with upon personal, rational calculation. One of the highlights of the Pyongyang summit this time, as many people have noted, was the South Korean president's speech to 150,000 Pyongyang citizens in the big stadium, May 1st stadium in Pyongyang, which I understand is the second largest, the largest in the world, the second largest being the Big House Stadium in Michigan, in Michigan. Anyway, it was not only the first and only time so far the South Korean president directly addressed Pyongyang citizens. I believe it was the first time that a North Korean leader addressed such an audience, because the Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il, never made a public speech, as far as I know, and Kim Jong-un would read a speech on a big parade or speak to an audience of his party members and so on. But this time he addressed ordinary Pyongyang citizens, and there both president, the chairman and the president, told the Pyongyang citizens that they had agreed on a complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And the audience responded enthusiastically. Of course, North Korean audience would respond enthusiastically to anything that their superior leader says, but I think there was genuine enthusiasm. And if you come to think of it, why not? I mean, why would ordinary North Koreans not be happy and told that the leadership had decided to give up nuclear weapons in exchange for prosperity and well-being of all the common people? So that was a really memorable moment. Another highlight was what many of you may have seen on television, the fraternization, fraternizing of the two leaders and their wives on the top of the Petdu mountain, holding their hands up and together and so on. And the thought struck me that this is probably the kind of thing that the hardline promoters of the sanctions regime hope that they may prevent. But once this is done, you can't say that they are violating the United Nations sanctions. Only they're just exchanging nice words and holding hands together and so on, and not even John Bolton could say that this was in violation of the sanctions. And that made me think that there are a lot of things, even under the sanctions regime, that the two Koreas do together, and moreover, they are out to do it. And to the benefit of the United States too, I think, because this Pyongyang meeting really set the U.S.-North Korean negotiations going again after a long period of desk. So I think they were doing Americans a favor too. Now I'll say a few words about denuclearization and South Korea's role. The most frequently asked question that I encountered was, how can you trust Kim Jong-un to keep his promises of denuclearization, to denuclearize? Now, first, I think you should note that Kim Jong-un never promised a unilateral denuclearization. So he has no promise to break on that count. What he did promise was denuclearization, complete denuclearization of Korean Peninsula, which means removal of not only North Korean nuclear arms, but nuclear threats by the United States from the Peninsula in exchange for security guarantees for the North Korean regime and in tandem with mutual confidence building steps. And I think the Singapore summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un really made a historic decision in that they agreed to do this and to reverse the previous policy of starting from a position of mistrust and then trying to take certain steps toward denuclearization and have those steps verified along the way. This time, the first article in the Sentosa joint statement does not mention denuclearization. It mentions the beginning of a new relationship between the United States and DPRK, the Democratic Republic of Korea. So this was a complete turn around from the previous United States position. Trump agreed with Kim Jong-un that the process of trust building comes first, and on that basis they will proceed to achieve complete denuclearization. I'm not sure that Mr. Trump quite realized what he had done, and I'm pretty certain that many of his aides are opposed to that approach. So what they keep saying is really goes quite contrary to this first article and second of the Sentosa joint statement. Now, on extreme case, is what I read recently of Senator Lindsey Graham's statement, saying that Mr. Trump should stop all this love crap and lay down before Kim Jong-un condos of death. That is, would he agree to build condos presumably supported by American capital in North Korea, or would he face death and destruction? Now, as far as I know, the North Koreans are very eager to and willing to build condos, but you can't do this if you keep receiving death threats from a stronger power as the United States. Now, Lindsey Graham's expressions are rather extreme, but I suspect he really reflects the majority opinion of the American people, or at least the American elite. So I think the Trump administration, if left to itself, really won't manage to get very far. And this is where South Korea's mediating role comes in. Yes, and I've spoken to some American audiences on this trip, and also had conversations with students and so on. And another very frequently asked question is, how can we trust Kim Jong-un of North Korea? But I think perhaps the more relevant question for Americans to ask is, how can they trust us? Because the United States is so much more powerful than North Korea or any other country in the world. And if the United States decides to renege on any of its promises, there is not much that North Korea or anybody can do about it. So I think, of course, it's a legitimate question to ask whether we can trust North Koreans. But we should also ask, can they really trust the United States? So my impression is that if left to themselves, the United States and North Korea are not likely to get very far. On the other hand, they have already come too far, especially North Korea, to go back to its previous stance of nuclear armament and confrontation with the United States. So this is where President Moon Jae-in, South Korea's president's mediating role is essential. And this, I think, the fact is increasingly appreciated by North Korea and the United States. I think at the time, immediately after the first summit meeting between North Korea and the United States, they did express some thanks to Moon Jae-in for the contribution that he had made. But I think at that time, they granted him a very subsidiary role. But I think it's becoming increasingly clear that they won't get very far without Moon Jae-in's role. Now, the second summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un has not taken place yet, but if and when it does, it will have been largely because of the input by South Korean president. Now, here I will come to the Candlelight Revolution. Now, as the things progress, very difficult, on a difficult road towards some kind of solution, Moon Jae-in's, our President Moon Jae-in's diplomatic and political skills are highly praised, and I don't want to take any credit from him, but from what I know of Mr. Moon Jae-in, and in comparison with former democratic presidents like Kim Dae-jung or Jong-un, I don't think his political skills are coming to their standards. They were really, Kim Dae-jung especially was a consummate politician, as well as a great statesman. Moon Jae-in is a very different type of man, really averse to politics, and it took a long time and effort by many people to draft him into politics. Now he's doing very well, but I think not so much because of his political and diplomatic skills, because I don't want to take anything away from him on that count, but mainly because he represents the Candlelight Revolution in South Korea. So he enjoys great authority, and if he's pressured by Donald Trump or the American officials, he can always fall back on the position. The phrasing is mine. I wrote this in a column. But he can always tell them that, look, I'd like to oblige you, but I am the head of the Candlelight government in South Korea, and if I oblige you too much, I can be just destroyed in a minute by our citizens. So I think that gives him a great power in negotiating with foreign countries. And I think his so-called non-political quality really qualifying very much for this kind of role. That is to be true to the Candlelight Revolution and to communicate with the people, and also to be genuinely devoted to the cause of the Candlelight citizens. Now, so I think he can display his diplomatic and political skills in relation with the foreign countries, because he can speak from a position of strength that neither Kim Il-jung nor Roh-moo-hyun enjoyed at the time. Now, I will take up the question whether the so-called Candlelight Revolution really adds up to a genuine revolution. Many celebrators of the Candlelight Revolution point to the complete lack of violence, to the mobilization of existing constitutional and legal frames to bring about a profound change in our society, and the joyous, celebratory atmosphere in the Candlelight demonstrations, and so on. But according to most social scientists, these are precisely features that disqualify those events from being a real revolution. I don't know how real revolution can exactly be defined, but we usually think of the classical revolutions in France in 1789, or Russia in 1917, and so on. So the Candlelight demonstrations and their aftermath are characterized by these social scientists and historians as a restoration and reactivation of the existing constitutional order rather than a genuine revolution. Now, in my opinion, such analysis disregards the existence and the nature of what I call the division system on the Peninsula, and its reliance on what I've called a hidden constitution, a verso constitution, delimiting from the very beginning of the Republic in 1948 the rule of law and efficacy of the Constitution. What the Candlelight Revolution accomplished was not a reactivation, but activation for the first time of the mostly democratic constitutions that we had, including the constitution of 1987, the last time we had a democratic uprising to change the regime. That is, what the Candlelight Revolution represented was a change from a country where the Constitution was not observed to one that will observe it. So this is a more, this is in a way a more radical change than a simple violent overthrow of the regime. And also, because South Korea is part of what I call the Peninsula division system, these changes in South Korea, as we see today, have begun to produce really dramatic and drastic changes in the Peninsula division system. So, Peninsula changes can be as revolutionary as any drastic change of regime within a given part of the divided peninsula. I don't know how much time I have, but I want to say this, I think this is an important theoretical question. I would like to add two further points. One, the Candlelight Revolution from 2016 on represents an advance on the previous civil revolution of 1987, thus representing a different order of achievement from the overthrow, peaceful or otherwise, of a repressive regime for the first time. We've seen many of those cases, and the results are not always as happy as we may see in the Korean Peninsula. Secondly, this achievement needs also to be seen in the global context of classic revolutions proving increasingly difficult to come by, while violent suppression of popular uprisings, although frequent enough in reality, becomes, I think, increasingly burdensome even to the dictatorial regimes on account of general advance in human rights and consciousness and technological dissemination and technological developments, facilitating communication and dissemination of information across national borders. Hence, those looking for real revolutions on the model of the French or Russian Revolution face the danger of running out of new subjects to study. Okay. And I mentioned the division system as background for this Candlelight Revolution. That is, the Candlelight Revolution qualifies as a real revolution because it occurs in the context of the division system and bringing radical changes to that system. When I say division system, I don't mean the partition I don't mean just the partition of the peninsula in 1945. I mean the system that set in after we had an internecine war between 1950 and 53, then an armistice agreement which has continued to this day, that is in a state of neither war nor peace. And so the certain peninsula-wide order has set in and became solidified, and this I call the division system. But it's not the same level, doesn't have the same level of systemic nature as the world system or the South Korean or North Korean system within that part, within the respective parts. One could call the division regime indicate that it's a sort of use of the term system, but then it can be confused with the individual divided regimes. So I use the term division system. This division system first entered the crisis stage in 1987 because one of the pillars of the system, which was the dictatorship on the South, fell through democratization. But that event shook but did not quite overcome the division system itself. So in the ensuing years, there were many ups and downs in the process of democratization itself. And later on, under Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye, even there was even possibility, danger of the whole democratizing process to be reversed. But this danger was removed very dramatically and decisively removed by the Candlelight revolution. And this deterioration, I mean, by nature, it's in the nature of the division system that this deterioration in domestic democracy went hand in hand with deterioration in North-South in the Korean relations. And we even came to the brink of another war in the past 2 years or so. So as I say, the Candlelight Revolution reversed the trend, and the division system now, I think, has real prospects of being finally overcome. But I don't mean overcome through reunification, but through a process which was already agreed upon by the two Korean leaders back in the year 2000. That is, they agreed for some kind of eventual reunification, but not any time soon. And what's more important, they agreed on a phased, step-by-step unification. And the first step would be something in between the South Korean proposal for a union of two sovereign states, which in Korean is called 국가연합, and what the North Koreans call the low stage of federation, 낮은 단계 연방제, which in fact would mean some kind of confederation. So the two leaders recognized that there was something in common between the two proposals, and that they would promote reunification along that line. Now the language is very ambiguous. I think it's in a way a triumph of diplomacy that arrived at kind of ambiguous expression that both sides could accept. But one thing that is very clear, but not commonly noticed by people, is that they have agreed on a step-by-step phased process of reintegration, which did not happen anywhere in recent history. Not in Germany, not in Vietnam, and not in Yemen either, even though I think they had reunification on two installments, because the first phase failed and they had a civil war, and then North Vietnam triumphed. So, yes, so this was agreed in the year 2000. And I think the process of building something like a union of two sovereign states began in earnest in the year 2007, after the second Inter-Korean Senate Summit. They agreed on many concrete steps for mutual exchange, consultation, and cooperation. And there were many measures that, if continued, would have led to perhaps a low stage union of the two states. And that process was stopped by the coming to power of, I don't use the term conservative, reactionary regimes of Iran and Pakistan. And it's a Candlelight revolution against these regimes that enabled the two Koreas to produce the Panmunjom Declaration last April and to reactivate the process of building relatively low level of union. And so I've used the expression 낮은 단계의 국가연합, which I would translate in English. I would put it as an association to the Korean states, like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. A very loose kind of union, much looser than the European Union. Even if we have the kind of arrangement, there won't be a free movement of people, no common currency. But unlike the European Union, this will be an association between two parts of an entity that had lived for many thousand years, or at least more than 1,000 years as a single unified nation, and have always agreed for some kind of eventual reunification, even though they did not want reunification in the near future. So even a very loose kind of association could have an entirely different meaning from what the European nations agreed in their union. Because in Europe there is no agreement as to about eventual unification. So I think in the Korean context, even a loose association of the two Korean states could qualify as the first stage of reunification. And I think that process has started or restarted and is going on very vigorously, I think. And I don't think the United States, even the United States can stop the process. They can delay it, but can't stop the process. And if the second Trump-Kim summit happens and produces some results, the process will be hastened even further and will become even more difficult to reverse. Now, this is not something that's only desired by the Koreans. I think that without this process going on, there will not be a complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. Because whatever security guarantees that the United States offers, and it's not clear how much they are willing to offer yet, but whatever, even full guarantees, even if the U.S. fully guarantees and normalizes its relations with North Korea and so on, the guarantees will not be enough, because there is no such thing as complete, irreversible guarantees in history, but especially with a strong superpower like the United States, you cannot really trust that the security guarantees will be long-lasting. Because if, in case, for whatever reason, the United States changes its mind, nobody is strong enough to stop the United States from doing it. And we have seen, and the North Koreans are very aware of what happened to Iraq, Libya, and recently with Iran. Trump tore up the international agreement. So there will be, of course, other additional guarantees by neighboring countries and so on. But it is, I think it will be necessary for North and South Korea to have institutionalized a political arrangement so that if the United States changes its mind and decides to attack North Korea, or at least to take hostile attitude toward North Korea, that should mean taking a hostile attitude toward the association of two Korean states, of which one is supposed to be an ally of the United States. So I think that's the kind of guarantee, security guarantee, that will be needed for the completion of the denuclearization process. This kind of association is also necessary because there is a different kind of threat to North Korea that the North Koreans don't speak much about these days. Perhaps because of pride, in any case because the immediate priority is the relations with the United States. But unlike China or Vietnam, when they embarked on a process of opening and economic reform, North Korea would still be faced with South Korea, which will be economically much stronger, and stronger militarily too once the North Koreans get rid of the nuclear weapons. So the very presence of South Korea would represent a serious security threat. Now, this cannot be completely removed, but it can be managed if there is an association of the two states, so that there will be a mutual guarantee of the other security and agreement to manage any emergency situations together. So I think this idea of an association of North Korean states is not some far-fetched idealistic notion, but it's a very realistic issue, probably indispensable to the process of denuclearization. So I think I have talked long now. So I'll stop here and look at the discussion today.
Well, you've been talking a lot, so maybe I should say a couple of things. To start us off, that was a very interesting presentation. But what I was thinking is that a person like you is really impossible in this country. In other words, you're a leading intellectual. You have been for many years. You edited the leading critical intellectual journal, and yet you go to Pyongyang with Moon Jae-in. This would be inconceivable for a critical intellectual in the United States. When we think of an American who might be comparable, it would be Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski, perhaps, but they're not really, they weren't intellectuals. Well, Henry's still alive, so still not an intellectual. They were national security specialists. And I have friends of my generation and younger who were dissidents and who were tortured, in fact, in the 1970s, and who became ambassadors or close advisors to aggressive presidents in Korea. And I mean, I think it's very admirable that kind of interaction and dialogue occurs among intellectuals and policymakers. But I wonder what you attribute it to. Is there, what would account for this difference between Korea and the United States, do you think?
Well, for a long time, the United States was sort of a beacon to the democratic nation, and the big reasons for it. And Korea was really the reverse. Absolute, not absolute, but autocratic monarchy up until the early years of the 20th century, and then years of then dictatorship on both sides. But I think we Koreans had learned through this very bitter experience to fight for our rights, and also to see peaceful means of achieving our aim. And this process really starts in March 1919, when the whole country rose up against the Japanese in peaceful demonstrations. They were just saying, "Manze, 대한독립 manze," course, it caused a great deal of bloodshed because the Japanese authorities suppressed those demonstrations by violent means. But it was, I think, notable for two things. Next year will be the 100th anniversary of those I think one is that it was a peaceful demonstration. And secondly, this is a point observed by Sun Yuan, or Sun Yat-sen, the Chinese leader of the 1911 revolution. He said he was really amazed that people who had been colonized would rise up in less than 10 years to stage this kind of resistance. So I think our learning process started at least from that. And of course, after the revolution in South Korea, many practices, people 1960, 1980 on June uprising, 1987 did succeed So I think Koreans have finally come of age, whereas the United States, after being great example of democratic transformation, they have entered a stage of decline. I hope not. I hope it's not a process of permanent decline. What do you think?
That's a separate question. But I think even though you had autocratic monarchy for hundreds of years, you had scholar officials who would demonstrate with the king. And Koreans have always had a high respect for scholars, unlike this guy. And I think probably that has something to do with it too. A person like yourself really is at not only you, but a scholar in general is really at the top of the Korean prestige for you.
Well, you're right, but the Korean monarchs were not nearly as autocratic as the Chinese emperors. The power of the scholarship was much greater in Korea.
Yeah.
I think also this is the difference of Japan, where the scholars were in service to the samurai, the warriors. So, in a way, they were the servants. Whereas in Korea, scholars only thought themselves as masters of the country.
Yes, and the kings were required to be scholars.
Yes.
And many of the best ones spent a lot of time studying classics, even while they were kings. Well, we've gotten into, I think, a good explanation of this phenomenon. I wanted to come back to what you said about Kim Jong-un and whether we can trust him or not. One of the things that aggravates me a lot about coverage of North Korea and the United States is that one pundit comes on after another and they say, well, the North Koreans always cheat, they never hold on to their agreements, you can't trust them as far as you can throw them, they're just a bunch of cheaters. When in fact they had their entire plutonium complex under a freeze from 1994 to 2002. And then they also seemed to be ready to mothball their medium and long-range missiles in 2000 in an agreement with the Clinton administration. And I just wonder, I guess, A, what you think of this constant American refrain, and B, what the North Koreans think, because from their point of view, we've also violated solemn agreements with them, particularly during the George W. Bush administration. I remember reading in the North Korean press, they were saying, how can we make diplomatic agreements with one administration and then you get somebody else and they act like those agreements were never made? So it's a problem of trust going both ways. But I wonder, in your conversations with North Koreans, what do you think is their deep down true view of the United States and making agreements with the U.S.?
I think they too mistrust the United States, at least as much as the Americans mistrust the North Koreans. And the Americans talk about the North Koreans' track record. I think the track record is quite flawed on both sides. And they have more reason to not only to mistrust, but fear the United States. Because this is so much powerful country. If a strong guy, a big strong guy, and a small guy make agreements, the strong guy can break it and get away with it. The weak guy really cannot. I understand that recently Kim Jong-un told jae-in that he will go back on his promises. So he said, if we go back, the United States will retaliate. And how can we cope with that? What he said. So I think
Mutual mistrust. In your presentation, you brought up the North Korean position. The U.S. position is denuclearization, and the North Korean position is getting rid of the nuclear threat. And another thing that is completely overlooked in this country is the 60 or 70-year history of American nuclear threats against North Korea. I mean, historians know about this. The facts are known. Top secret documents have been declassified for years, but it doesn't break into our discussion. It's always the North Koreans that are the problem. But even Barack Obama, who in many ways I think was an admirable foreign policy leader, periodically would send nuclear-capable B-2 bombers in near Korean waters just to intimidate the North Koreans. And I wonder, I guess I have two questions. What do you think about this? And in South Korea, is this history very well known or not? So the U.S. actually dropped dummy atomic bombs on North Korea during the Korean War to see if, in Operation Hudson Harbor, to see if it might be useful to use nuclear weapons in battlefield situations. So that was 1951, and a lot of things happened after that.
well, I would say a great proportion of South Koreans know about the past threats of the use of nuclear weapons against North Korea. But still not the majority are aware. Many people do when we were in the crisis of 1994, right, when the U.S. did contemplate nuclear strikes against North Korea. But they didn't forget what during the war.
Well, a long time ago. I remember that you and I had the discussion, it was in 2008 or 9, about the imminent government, the reactionaries coming in, as you said. And I wrote some editorial where I said there's too much toothpaste out of the tube for them to get it back in. But after 2 successive right-wing governments, I was worried that they packed a lot of toothpaste back into the tube. And it seems to me that this bears on your presentation or your work, really, because the division system is a very strong system. It has been reinforced since 1953, if not earlier. Very strong on both sides. People get promoted, applauded for doing nasty things to the other side. So that's on the one hand. And the division system supports presidents like Nak-Chung Paik and Nak-Chung Paik. What you've presented today seems to me to be less strong in that its underpinnings don't have the historical backing of the division system, an association between North and South. And I wonder how you can say that you think that's going to be strong enough to hold together under a lot of pressure from the US or wherever, and the toothpaste won't go back in the tube.
Well, first let me say that you expressed it at that time, trying to put that toothpaste back into the tube, really struck me, and I've used it since then.
I'm sure you gave me a footnote.
However, they seem for a while to be succeeding in some of the states, but it really never succeeded. After that, I'm sure one day I could follow, but her regime wasn't even close to the factory. The times have changed, and also there are differences in personal capabilities, but the times have changed so much. And one of the changes was the democratic revolution in 1970. And she believed that she tried very much. And one of my colleagues had used the term creeping coup d'etat for what she was trying to do. But first, it had to be creeping because the times have changed. And secondly, she was overthrown because of creeping.
I'm sure she thought it was a coup d'etat against her.
Yeah, I'm sure. But I think the establishment, the formal establishment of an association to create states, I don't know when that will come. I think the process towards that is now ongoing, and when there is sufficient accumulation of various cooperative movements and institutions, then the two sides could one day decide, well, that can't why not declare the established association, and there will still be two sovereign states, each a member of the United Nations. But I think if that happens, it will really be a point where all the other toothpaste
Escapes the tube.
It really be an irreversible step.
One thing you didn't mention, and it really wasn't part of the theme, is that when you look at democratic transitions around the world, not only has South Korea been one of the most successful, I think sometimes overlooked, but all those people putting their feet in the street in 1987 and 2002, and then the Candlelight revolution, very, very impressive. But what is also really impressive is that the Korean economy has done so well. Not as well as it did during the heyday of double-digit growth, but I mean, South Korea has become one of the leading industrial powers in the world. Now, I remember when Kim Dae-jung came to power, he won the election in December 1997. The Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, to some extent the New York Times, were all saying this is a disaster. He's a radical. He's the worst person to put the economy back together again. And you never know what's going to happen tomorrow, and I didn't myself know exactly how well he would be able to do, but in fact he had the Korean economy back in better shape than any of the other Asian economies affected by the 1997 crisis, in addition to a number of democratic measures like bringing labor into peak negotiations and all of that. And I think when you look at it that way, Korea has just had a remarkable 20 or 25 years of democratization and maintaining strong economic growth. The one thing it hasn't really done is break the hold of the chaebol groups on the economy. I mean, there's still 75 to 80% of the economy, but they've been punished enough so they're not intervening in politics that much, it seems. Or they've collapsed like they do. So that's more of a comment than a question, but I do have a question, which is, I don't know nearly as many people as you do that are close to Moon Jae-in, but I have a couple people I know, friends and so on. And one of them really emphasized to me that Moon Jae-in's approach toward North Korea fundamentally is economic. He has to do denuclearization because that's what the U.S. wants, but he's more focused on bringing North Korea out of isolation, reestablishing the Kaesong export zone, the zone in Haeju and elsewhere, re-stitching the railways between the two halves of Korea, and that he sees this as an incremental but very important way of bringing North Korea out of isolation, and it fits very well with the path that Kim Jong-un has been on since his New Year's address in January. Wonder what you think about that.
Well, I don't think Moon Jae-in's personal approach benefits to the economy. I suspect that he has some notion of building this association with that state that I speak of. I don't think he has really made the connection between the two parties. I said this process of building an association is essential to the success of reunification. But I believe it's also essential to the success of the opening economy, because the opening and economic reform are really very dangerous process for the North Korean regime. You don't know what will happen, and really nobody knows. But having this kind of political association with South Korea will give a certain sense of security and a certain guarantee about the common management of the Peninsula economic situation. I believe Moon Jae-in has some ideas. He's sympathetic to the idea of an association, but I'm not sure that he really makes the connection between his economic design and...
Well, but he was the chief of staff at the second summit when Nomihyun made these economic agreements, and so he's at least fully aware of that background.
I mean, he's aware of the economic agreements planning, and also he is very intent on economic cooperation with North Korea. What I'm saying is that he may not really have integrated in his mind the notion of political association and economic cooperation. By the way, he was chief of staff from the President Nong-hyun, and in that capacity, he headed the committee to prepare context. But I don't think at the time he was very knowledgeable about the Korean problem.
Dr. Beck has taken Moon Jae-in down a couple of segments in my estimation. I was going around saying I thought he was probably doing better than Kim Dae-jung or Nong-hyun.
Oh, I'm not denying that. I'm only saying that that's thanks to the Candlelight citizens.
Yeah.
Not because of his personal diplomatic and political skills, which I don't think it would be unfair to say that they are really uncommon often.
Much closer to the situation, so it's a very...
Even with really exceptional person in that respect, even some people were great Machiavellian.
Well, I remember an old Korean friend of mine who taught at Dayton University and then finally went back to Korea to work with Kim Dae-jung around 1990, a long time ago. And after he worked with Kim Dae-jung for a little while, he said, "You've read Machiavelli? He's 10 times more Machiavellian than Machiavelli." So he was a great politician, but he also managed to maintain his ethical approach to life through his religion and like that. But I think in addition to the opportunities provided by Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un, Trump has provided a big opportunity for Korea, don't you think?
Yes, and I want to ask you, what do you think of it? And of all people, this Trump, who is doing something for peace in the Korean Peninsula, that neither Obama or anyone else did. I mean, Bill Clinton tried, and stopped.
Well, I mean, I operate in circles where you can't say a good thing about Trump without people jumping down your throat. But I wrote in, I don't know where, the Bulletin of Atomic Science, I think in June, it's the short piece that whatever you think of Trump, he's looking at the Korean situation. I used the term innocent eyes, and I got criticism with that. What I meant was innocent of history. He doesn't know anything about Korea. He found out the war wasn't over. And a little light went off in his head thinking that I can get the Nobel Peace Prize by bringing an end to the Korean War. But he also, I mean, there's a very interesting aspect to the way he looks at Korea. He gave a news conference just a week or two ago, and the media didn't pick up on this, but he directly criticized severely what he calls the war games. Not just that they're expensive, but that they're ridiculous. No American president has ever said that. But there is a really ridiculous aspect to them because South Korea is one of the only countries in the world where we can mobilize 70 or 80,000 Korean and American troops and do big war games. You know, you have to do it much smaller in Germany or other countries. And, that, along with his contempt for his own staff. I mean, people, we talk about the White House. If you read the book Fear by, what's his name? Woodward. Or the first book like that, Fire and Fury, basically what is going on in the White House. Total chaos in the White House. But nobody can throw a saddle on Trump. He just won't be controlled. And in that sense, since he's in love with Kim Jong-un, maybe, some progress that can be made that would not be made with either a garden variety Democrat or a Republican in the White House. And we're testing that right now, but so far, so good, I would say.
Well, I would agree that it's probably his total disconnection from the mainstream respectable opinion in the United States
Right.
that enables him to try a fresh approach. And you mentioned his talk of war games. And really, when he said at the press conference after the ceremony that these war games are not only expensive, but threatening to the
Right.
North Koreans.
Right. Which they are.
It was really a fresh shock to me to hear this from an American president, because up to that time, nobody in the United States or in South Korea, except those in the fringes,
Yeah.
would concede that these games, war games, would be threatening to North Korea. All the threat came from North Korea, and whatever we did was normal, customary exercise.
Well, when I wrote that article, I got a really nasty email from somebody saying, how can you say, basically, say nice things about Donald Trump? He went on and on. And I'm not on social media because I don't need a hailstorm of messages like that. Email is bad enough, but I wrote back to the guy and I said, look, read my article carefully. I think Trump's probably the worst president who's ever occupied the Oval Office. But there are silver linings, you know, even if, I don't know, Caligula occupied the White House. So people need to have a little bit of nuance in their view of Trump. And I actually find him often quite funny in the way he has contempt for the Washington establishment. I mean, he's called almost all of them one name or another over the last 3 years. You know, one bad name or another.